I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be the first of the speakers. My talk is entitled, Why C.S. Lewis is as Influential as Ever. C.S. Lewis died on the same day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The news of Kennedy's death swamped what would otherwise have been a major story on the death of one of the most influential men of his time. 50 years later, Lewis is today arguably far more influential than Kennedy. Lewis's books have been translated into more than 40 languages and have sold millions of copies. The 7 books that make up the Chronicles of Narnia, first published more than 60 years ago, have sold the most, estimated at around 150 million sets, and have been popularized on stage, TV, radio, and the movies. Since 2001, Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, has sold 3 million copies, and the Screwtape Letters, 2 million copies. It is estimated that annual sales of Lewis's books range as high as 6 million copies. In all, there are about 110 authored or edited books by Lewis and about 300 books that discuss him and his work, with additional new ones published every year, many becoming bestsellers. The combined box office sales for the 3 Narnia films so far totals $1.5 billion, and the film series is the 24th highest grossing series of all time. A 4th film based on The Silver Chair is now in production. Until the Harry Potter book series, the 7 volumes of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia were the most influential children's books of all time in the world, voted so by successive polls of parents, librarians, teachers, and also by their sales. And the Potter books haven't cut into Narnia's market. Indeed, they've greatly expanded it as sales of the Narniad have increased by 20% during this time. Today, there are also over 300 C.S. Lewis societies around the world, and a C.S. Lewis college is in the works in Massachusetts. For me, Lewis provides a clear articulation of what it means to be a Christian in today's modern world. For Lewis, Christianity was something that captured the mind, fired the imagination, and filled the heart. And becoming a Christian changed the way he viewed the world and the people in it. There are several reasons why Lewis, we think, is so important. Number 1, Lewis showed that reason is the anchor of faith. By presenting a defense of the Christian faith that appealed to reason, Lewis removed obstacles to faith that most people in our world face today. Lewis removed obstacles to faith by restoring reason to its rightful place. Lewis showed how Christianity could appeal to those earnestly seeking answers to today's greatest questions of life. As Lewis noted, quote, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head, unquote. Number 2, Lewis punctured the pomposity and the pretension of modern elite intellectuals. For example, Lewis revealed that you cannot trust your own reason if you are solely the product of random chance evolution. Lewis tied faith and reason together, in which Christianity is both faithful and rational. Number 3, Lewis noted that, quote, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning, unquote. The concept of story or narrative was crucial for Lewis. He showed that Christian imagination could expand our sense of what's possible. Christian imagination could re-enchant a world that has been disenchanted by the limited possibilities of modernism and scientism. He showed that speaking about God in non-religious terms is vital, making the truths of Christianity fresh and novel. And number 4, Lewis restored a Christian vision of humanity, the eternal destiny of every human being. As a result, he fought against the dehumanizing aspects of modern culture. Lewis spent most of his career as a medieval and Renaissance scholar at Oxford University in England. Then, as today, being an avowed Christian in academia, or indeed in the public eye at all, was not a good way to advance one's career. And he was accordingly denied the English equivalent of a tenured position at Oxford for 20 years, despite the fact that his books were bestsellers and his lectures consistently drew standing room only crowds. He eventually moved to Cambridge University when he was offered a tenured position. Today, few people are aware that Lewis was a medieval and Renaissance scholar. Beyond Narnia, Lewis is best known as a Christian apologist, but he certainly didn't set out to be such. In fact, from his teenage years until his 30s, he was an avowed atheist, and his greatest wish had been to become a poet. As a young child, Lewis was tutored at home by his mother, including in French and Latin. Her death, when he was 9, had a devastating effect on him and may well have planted the seed of his subsequent atheism. He prayed for his mother's recovery from cancer, and his prayers were not answered as he desired. This problem of pain, quote unquote, if God is good and all-powerful, why do bad things happen to good people, may be the root of more people turning away from belief than any other. Lewis's father reacted to his beloved wife's death by drawing into himself, and Lewis and his older brother Warren were especially and essentially left bereft. Following a disastrous time at a brutal boarding school in England, Lewis's father moved him into a home of a private tutor by the name of William Kirkpatrick, or the Great Knock. The Great Knock was characterized by Lewis as, quote, a hard, satirical atheist who taught me to think, unquote. Lewis was thus set on a path of strict, rationalistic atheism. He came to believe in the meaninglessness of life and that we need to build our lives on the basis of, quote, unyielding despair, unquote, as he put it. Lewis's way of stating it was, quote, nearly all I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless, unquote. In his imagination, he loved to read about truth, goodness, and beauty, but in his reason, he held to a rather dark view of life. This tension between reason and imagination continued to increase. Despite his best intention to be a strict atheist, the things he liked best to read and the people he liked best to be with turned out to be, oh no, Christian. At the age of 16, waiting for a train, he bought a copy of the book Phantastes by the Scottish writer and former Presbyterian minister George MacDonald. The book was in the train bookshop. Its deeply Christian themes resonated with him, and he later said of the book, quote, that night my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer. I had not the faintest notion what I had let myself in for buying Phantastes, unquote. In a similar way, he loved G.K. Chesterton's books. Quote, in reading Chesterton as in reading George MacDonald, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous, unquote. At Oxford, his greatest friend was J.R.R. Tolkien, and one night, after walking and talking with Tolkien and another friend, Hugo Dyson, they talked and walked until 3 in the morning, Lewis finally came to accept Christ and Christianity at the age of 33. At 17, Lewis had written to his best friend, quote, I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best, unquote. 15 years later, he wrote to the same friend, quote, Christianity is not the best. Christianity is God expressing himself through what he called real things, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. Lewis called himself the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. So within 15 years, he moved from being an absolute atheist to being a devout convert. He clearly became the most influential in England. And certainly the fact that he was such a disciplined thinker and had spent so many years working through the case against Christianity to finally reason himself into knowing it to be true provided him the basis for which to communicate those arguments to the world. And Lewis had a profound impact on the world. But again, what accounts for this influence, which continues to grow? The 20th century has been described as the century of modernism, the development of the narrative that under the centuries of belief in Christianity, humanity had lived in a dark ages of pre-science and superstition, the so-called flat earth era. This modernist narrative claims that the so-called Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century represented the triumph of secular science over superstition, ushering in a new era of progress and reason. Further, the belief in undirected evolution replaced that of a purposeful creator God. Now, as a medieval and Renaissance scholar, Lewis knew that the university, science, and reason had been products of Christianity, including the producing of primary medieval astronomy book named Sphere, which was used in almost all the schools. As a sociologist, Riding Stark discusses in his books The Victory of Reason and How the West Won, early and medieval Christianity displaced paganism and its widespread slavery, infanticide, repression of women, disregard for the suffering, and a world of chaos and superstition, ushering in Western civilization in which the secular and the sacred were unified, producing a theopolitical worldview of hope, joy, liberty, justice, and purpose from the loving grace of God that enabled them to discover the objective, natural law principles of ethics, science, and theology. Stark shows that the result created a bountiful culture of art and literature, plus an immense human flourishing from individual liberty, personal responsibility, free market entrepreneurship, civic virtue, limited government, and the rule of law. Lewis was alarmed by his first-hand witnessing of the results of modernism, including the development of the total state and total war, in which man became simply a cog in a galactic wheel. The themes of both his and Tolkien's writings reflect their directly seeing the growth of totalitarianism and the subjugation of the individual to the collective and the almighty state. Lewis wrote his book, The Abolition of Man, in response to his seeing the rise of moral relativism and utilitarianism, quote, the end justifies the means, unquote. And it and his novelized treatment of the same themes in his book, That Hideous Strength, are, if anything, more relevant today than when he wrote them decades ago. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis presented the case for the existence of a moral law, a natural moral law known by all. He called it the Tao, as in the way or the path, not to be confused with the Chinese philosophy, Taoism. Now, this natural moral code, as Lewis shows, cannot be escaped. It is the source from which all moral judgments come. Its fundamental truths, maxims like good should be done and evil avoided, that caring for others is a good thing, that dying for a righteous cause is a noble thing, are known independently of experience. They are grasped in the same way that we know that 2 + 2 is 4. Here's Lewis, quote, if a man will go into a library and spend a few days with the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, he will soon discover the massive unanimity of the practical reason of man, from the Babylonian Hymn to Samos, from the Laws of Manu, the Book of the Dead, the Analects of Confucius, the Stoics, the Platonists, from Australian Aborigines, he will collect the same triumphantly monotonous denunciations of oppression, murder, treachery, and falsehood, the same injunctions of kindness to the aged, the young, and the weak, of almsgiving and impartiality and honesty. He may be a little surprised. I certainly was, as Lewis continues. I certainly was to find that the precepts of mercy are more frequent than the precepts of justice. But he will no longer doubt that there is such a thing as the law of nature, unquote. Lewis thus rejected the idea that only those who were Christian could understand to be moral because the natural law is fundamental to human existence and serves as the basis for human choice. He noted that if only Christians could grasp the natural law or understand morality, then there would be an irresolvable dilemma in which no one could be persuaded of morality who was not already Christian, and hence that no one could ever become Christian. The Apostle Paul put the same idea this way, quote, "When Gentiles do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. But even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bear witness, and their thoughts, now accusing, now even defending them," unquote. That's from Romans 2:14-15. Modernism and postmodernism deny this truth. The fact that we all know in our hearts when something is right or wrong, and replace it with the theories of moral relativism. There's no objective good, there's just what's good for me and what's good for you, and neither is better than the other. And utilitarianism. On the former, utilitarianism, Lewis pointed out that the person who claims there's no objective standard of good will be the loudest to cry when his seat is stolen on the bus, crying, "That's unfair. Where does the concept of fairness spring if there's no objective standard or morality?" Hence the link between utilitarianism and moral relativism. As Lewis noted in critiquing the modern view that only a material, purposeless world exists, quote, "You cannot go on seeing things forever. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see," unquote. For Lewis, science should be a quest for knowledge. And his concern was that in the modern era, science is too often used instead as a quest for power by some over others. Lewis did not dispute that science is an immensely important tool to understand the natural world, but his larger point is that science cannot tell us anything that is ultimately important regarding what choices we should make. In other words, Lewis shows that what is does not indicate what ought to be. Scientists on their own are not able to address moral ethics, and all social and political questions are exclusively questions of morality rooted in the natural law, the Tao. Lewis further viewed all those attempts to replicate the scientific method to analyze man or humankind as a strictly material, physical phenomenon as non-science, or what he called scientism. Quote, "Let scientists tell us about science, but government involves questions about the good for man and justice and what things are worth having at what price. And on these, a scientific training gives a man's opinion no added value." As any student will quickly find in most high schools and colleges today, and is embedded in much popular culture, the sciences become dominated by a naturalist or modernist or atheist or secular worldview that assumes that the universe and life are purposeless and that mankind is simply a more complex, material version of all else in the natural world. In other words, an individual human being is viewed as no more and no less than a system of molecular processes determined by physical laws. Human beings are claimed to be simply machines in a galactic machine. Quote, "We are matter in motion," unquote. In this system, all human behavior and ideas are determined solely as the product of a mechanistic, causal process of physical events. Such contemporary naturalist writers as the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, and others subscribe to a physicalism or naturalism according to which only the material world exists. According to Dawkins, quote, "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference," unquote. Lewis shows that material facts alone cannot provide any conclusion without some independent basis to evaluate such information. He claims that the analysis of any world requires the existence of people, including scientists, whose views themselves are not mechanistically determined by the world they are examining. So if Dawkins is denying anything other than this world, and that the only thing that frames or determines his own thoughts, he can't conclude or know that anything he says is true. He denies the existence of truth, so he's trying to have a sort of a schizophrenic, incoherent view, right? Indeed, if our mental processes are simply biochemical events, solely the product of Darwinian survival, we have no basis to know if our thoughts are true or not, because there is no standard for truth other than survival. Utilitarianism becomes the sole criterion for what to do, and there exists no objective good or evil. Here Lewis pointed out the naturalist determinist profound dilemma regarding the existence of individual consciousness and free will, including the naturalist's very own inability to argue for naturalism or any proposition, as I was suggesting. Quote, "Thus, no thoroughgoing naturalist can believe in free will. Free will would mean that human beings have the power of independent action, the power of doing something more or other than what was involved by the total series of events in which we exist. And any such separate power or originating events is what the naturalist denies. Spontaneity, originality, action on his own, creativity is a privilege reserved for the whole show, which he calls nature," unquote. Incidentally, naturalism as a creed is a very old one. A number of the pre-Socratic philosophers were probably the first to propose it as an early version of naturalism. Plato, Parmenides, and Aristotle discredited, by the way, these pre-Socratic naturalists. However, and it was not until much later, as the gentleman here was suggesting, much later that the naturalist creed resurfaced in a major way in the 18th and 19th centuries from the work of David Hume, Auguste Comte, Henri de Saint-Simon, Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, and other modern writers. With this worldview, Nietzsche logically proposed that man, quote, "is beyond good and evil," unquote. And behaviorist naturalist B.F. Skinner claimed that man is beyond freedom and dignity. To underscore this basic problem in the strict naturalist view, Lewis quotes the Marxist biologist J.B.S. Haldane, quote, "If my mental processes are determined solely by the motion of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms," unquote. This is from someone who is a naturalist and a determinist. But again, as Lewis has shown, to claim that individuals have no viewpoints is to present a thought that is possible only by having a point of view. In short, the denial of intention or intentional states is incoherent, and this is what passes for scholarship. It's really unbelievable. What is critical to free will is each of us not being caused to do something by causes other than oneself. To have free will means it is up to me how I choose, and nothing determines my choice. Philosophers call this agent causation. Each individual as an agent is the cause of his or her actions. Adam and Eve caused their actions. Moses caused his actions, etc. Each person's decisions are differentiated from random events by being done by the agent himself or herself by reasons the agent has in his or her mind. This understanding of free will, incidentally, has relevance to the case of God himself. Jesus, being divine, could not sin. Therefore, there was no possibility of his yielding to Satan's temptations in the wilderness. Yet he resisted sin freely because nothing external to him determined his choices. Jesus could not have chosen to sin, but he freely resisted sin. And God cannot choose to do evil, yet he freely does the good because nothing outside him determines him to do so. He is his own agent. We, in effect, reflect this reality, having been created in his image. What a great significance, what a huge difference from matter. Lewis understood that science arose because of the Christian theistic beliefs of the original scientists. Quote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. Try to make nature absolute, and you find that her uniformity is not even possible. Where does the uniformity come from? Unquote. In this regard, science rests upon what's called the dualism of a material and an immaterial, a natural and a supernatural, a physical and a metaphysical reality. To deny the metaphysical basis for science is to make science itself unintelligible and impossible. How do you describe what science is without a narrative, without a description, without the mind conceiving it and choosing what is true or not? Naturalism, along with its consequent scientism and collectivism, were simply matter in motion, with all the other matter that's in motion. This is an erroneous and self-contradictory view that not only fails, but breeds untruths that have led historically to repeated human folly and unspeakable horrors, certainly in the 20th century. Lewis clearly laid out the danger of the modern view of man as merely a creature to be molded and socially engineered by a scientific elite. Quote, either we are rational spirit, in the beginning there was the Word, either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or else we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses. That is, our rulers, as mere men and women, must by definition also be responding solely to survival instinct, if Dawkins is correct. So what makes us think their decision-making will be good? And what does that mean? Which, according to the naturalists, of course, does not exist. And there is no objective standard. Here's Lewis again. Only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. The process which, if not checked, will abolish man goes on apace among communists and Democrats, no less among fascists. The methods may at first differ in brutality and extent, but many a mild-eyed scientist many a popular dramatist, many an amateur philosopher in our midst means in the long run essentially just the same as the Nazi rulers of Germany, unquote. And throughout the modern world, this rule by man versus the Tao has spread across every civilization, not just those we think of as totalitarian. Lewis's observations are even more true today with, quote, with vast curtailments of liberty, and we have grown, though grumblingly, accustomed to our chains, our intellectuals have surrendered first to the slave philosophy of Hegel, then to Marx. As a result, classical political theory with its Stoic, Christian, and juristic key conceptions, natural law, the value of the individual, the rights of man, has died. The modern state exists not to protect our rights, but to do us good or to make us good. Anyway, to do something to us or to make us something. Hence the new name leaders for those who were once rulers. We are less their subjects than their wards, pupils, or domestic animals. There's nothing left of which we can say to them, mind your own business. Our whole lives are their business, unquote. Throughout Lewis's books, he defended the rights and sanctities of individuals against tyranny, not just because he opposed evil, but because he considered life in freedom, including both social and economic freedom, to be essential. Quote, I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he had the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by government, and in adult life it is man who needs and asks nothing of government, who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology. Who will talk like that when the state is everyone's schoolmaster and employer, unquote. And the danger of this, of course, is again that government consists solely of humans like us. Quote, man is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. I do not contradict him, but I reject slavery because I see no men fit to be masters, unquote. By showing throughout his work that the Tao is known and held universally, with Christianity providing the highest and purest view of God's truth, Lewis makes the powerful case that we are therefore inescapably God's creation. Lewis makes the powerful case that we are therefore inescapably God's creation. The argument that we are subject only to the forces of a godless nature, undirected, obeying only a survival instinct, utterly fails to account for our innate concepts of good, ought, right, and wrong. And unless we want to live in a world of unchecked government power, a world in which only might makes right, it is imperative that we learn from great thinkers like Lewis, who see and paint so clearly the implications of the dangerous ideas around us in the media, in academia, in popular culture, and the political realm. But doing so, we build upon the truths Christ taught, grounding ourselves in the knowledge of how we should live in our modern world and how we should regard and treat one another. In Lewis's book series, The Chronicles of Narnia, the land of Narnia is held in place by the sacred deep magic, or what we would call the natural law. And to transgress this moral code is to do evil, which is what the White Witch did, and others. Toward the end of the first book in the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy assume their thrones as kings and queens of Narnia. But what can they do as kings and queens? They can only enforce the deep magic. Lewis describes how they governed during the golden age of Narnia and their most important accomplishments. Quote, and they made good laws and kept the peace and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who want to live and let live, unquote. So thank you very much.
This person writes, neuroscientists proceed with the assumption that mind is physically based. If this is not the case, then are we introducing supernatural to science?
Are we doing
introducing supernatural?
Okay, well, the argument that Lewis would make is that without the existence of the supernatural, there is no free will and there's no individual agency to be a scientist. All right, you can't explain reason and free will and the existence of objective truth and any standard that can be replicated unless there is that existence. So, for example, do the multiplication tables exist objectively, or is simply our subjective projection? Does the number 7 exist? Does the idea of killing children and torturing children, is that an objective thing that we perceive? Or is it just that we happen to live here at this time, right? So Lewis's argument is that 2 + 2 = 4 is the same basic understanding as we have that killing innocent people is wrong. And we have this sense, and we can't get it out of our head. Even a Hitler does not randomly kill people. He has a theory, right? He applies it in a certain way. It's evil, but it's not everybody, right? So there is a check, and that's what we see, with all the great horrors and the things that are done that are not horrors. So the fundamental dilemma, Lewis, those of you who have not read the book Miracles by Lewis, I highly recommend it. The first few chapters is his critique of naturalism, showing that it's incoherent and self-refuting, as I was describing earlier. That if our minds are simply our brains, material brain, that ideas that we have are simply illusions created by biochemical reactions in the brain, and that everything that's ever existed in the history of the universe is simply a sequence of events that led to this moment when I have that biochemical reaction. I don't have any free will to determine it. I have no ability to discern or infer. It simply is, okay? But the person who makes the argument has to assume that he or she is not subject by that same metric. And so it's interesting, by the way, that every determinist theorist exempts themselves from their own theory.
Right. Thank you, David. I'm up here. I've got another question. Now, this question is kind of a practical question for a parent who wants to ask about literature for the children. Your insight on Lewis' sales during Potter popularity brought to mind concerns of parents on how fantasy plays for or against Christianity, especially in media or technology. So maybe if you can share maybe some, I don't know, some pros or cons in response to fantasy and how that helps Christianity.
Okay, this relates to what Calvin was saying earlier about imagination. Okay, now what Lewis is talking about is the idea of we have a mind and we try to make sense of our life and reality. Okay, we have a narrative, we have a story to explain what is true and what's not, what we expect to happen, what we think is going to happen, how do we get things done. We have this explanation, all right? Now the theory is different from data, okay? The theory is how we sort of interpret data or maybe how we look at the data. So mind before matter is the idea as opposed to mind after matter. So Lewis's point about imagination is that we conceive of a narrative of what is true. In the history of man, there are all sorts of myths and stories. There's the Iliad, there's the Aeneid, there's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Shakespeare and so on and so forth. And these are all imaginative narratives, all right? Whether they actually are historically true or not is secondary. They exist because they're expressing a series of truths that the characters and others are playing out, okay? And so what Lewis was affected by was he loved stories. He loved imagination. And I mentioned he picked up this book as a teenager called Phantastes by this Christian writer, George MacDonald. George MacDonald is viewed as the father of all modern fantasy. And Lewis, being an atheist at the time, didn't know what he was getting in for. And so if you haven't read the book or any of other MacDonald's books, you'd be surprised at what MacDonald's able to do. He's able to draw you in. So Lewis's way to describe this is, he called it, instead of looking at something, you're looking along it. You're entering into and you're experiencing the truths of the story. So think of it this way. You pick up a book, you look at the page, it has these squiggles on it, ink on this piece of wood, right? But as you start reading it, you enter a world and you forget you're looking at a page, right? Now try to think about the page and you immediately leave the story. It's like you enter in this other world, which is the world of imagination, right? And so Lewis is saying that that is what we are most completely. That's what we're doing. The Christian story is the perfect imagination, the perfect story, the true myth, as you put it. And so the story about his reading Phantastes inspired him to begin to see that the truths in Norse mythology and Egyptian mythology and Greek mythology, there are truths in that is why they endured. But the Christian story was the perfect truth. And so these others, the way he viewed it is that they're pointing towards certain truths. Now, certainly people can use this for ill too, right? They can depict evil and say that's what we should be. You should be a Wiccan or whatever it might be, right? And that's obviously catering to the same kind of base tendencies that everybody has, right? Including pride itself. So that's a real problem. Interestingly enough, with Rowling, after she wrote her 7th book in the series, she admitted not only is she a Christian, but she was inspired by Lewis and Tolkien. And so Paul Ashby, by the way, in our Lewis Book Club, led our discussion on Rowling's very interesting Christian imagery in the series. And you're welcome to talk to Paul about it. He's the expert on it.
I've got one last question before we close this afternoon, and it is, what are some ways that you are hopeful for movements, individuals and groups really seeking to grasp some deeper truths here and to really further some of the work that Lewis was all about? What are some areas that bring you hope when you get?
Well, one thing is the fact that Lewis's work continues to expand its reach, and people are discovering it and are going back to it. The fact that Lewis thought that his books would die out and go out of print within 2 or 3 years after he died, but that didn't happen. And people who've been influenced by Lewis, clearly through the Holy Spirit, have gone further. For example, his critique of naturalism in the book Miracles has been taken and advanced to a very, very sophisticated extent by a philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga. And we have one of his books on the table if you want to look at it. And Plantinga has created a whole new revolution in the field of philosophy, which has been challenging this atheist modernist lock that it's had for 100 years or something. And so there, all sorts of philosophers have converted, and there are new journals and societies, but that's just one field. And it's true in all the academic fields, some more than others. And in a popular sense, the fact that the films, we've been involved in helping, as you may know, with the promotion for his novel, The Screwtape Letters on stage, or The Great Divorce on stage. And they're sold out over and over again. So why would that be? Well, part of it is because many Christians want to see it, but it has standing in the secular world. That's the interesting thing. And this is part of what I think Calvin is suggesting, is that Lewis's work is of interest to almost every version of Christian, all right? Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, almost every single Protestant denomination. It's really this ecumenical kind of reach and respect, partly because of his concept of mere Christianity. But his work passes the test of the secular world of what is credible, what is good, what is excellent and well presented. It has the trappings. Why? Because he was a scholar in it, and he had the great talents to write. So it is interesting that this happens, but it doesn't mean that things may not get, I mean, the recent Hobbit trilogy is not exactly what Tolkien would have done, I'll tell you that. But still, even with the distortions of it, my view is the basic message comes through, and that's why it's successful. So.